The galactic arena was silent, filled with thousands of alien species who had gathered to witness what they believed would be humanity's greatest humiliation. The Xelvari Dominion, rulers of half the known galaxy, had never been defeated. Their greatest weapon was not their fleets or their soldiers, but a poison so deadly that no living being had ever survived it. They called it the Black Venom, a toxin that dissolved flesh, burned through veins, and left victims in excruciating agony before death finally claimed them. It was the weapon they used to bring entire civilizations to their knees, proving that resistance against them was futile. Now, they had issued a challenge to Earth. One human would drink the poison in front of the entire galaxy. If they survived, humanity would be spared. If they died, Earth would suffer the same fate as countless others. The challenge was meant to be a joke, a cruel reminder that no one could defy the Xelvari and live. The galaxy watched in morbid anticipation, waiting to see yet another species fall before the might of the Dominion. Captain Elias Carter stepped forward, his boots echoing against the cold metal floor as he walked toward the raised platform where the poison had been placed. He was a soldier, a man who had seen battle, but even he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The Xelvari stood in their ornate robes, their scaled faces twisted in amusement, confident in their victory before the challenge had even begun. The goblet before him shimmered with the thick black liquid inside. The poison seemed almost alive, swirling unnaturally, as if eager to consume its next victim. The Xelvari High Chancellor, a towering figure with dark green scales and piercing yellow eyes, leaned forward with a smirk. "Drink," he hissed, his voice slithering through the silent arena. "Prove that humanity is anything more than an insignificant pest." Elias didn't hesitate. He reached out, gripping the goblet with steady fingers, and raised it to his lips. There was no fear in his eyes, no doubt in his movements. The entire galaxy was watching, billions of eyes focused on the single human who dared to defy the most feared species in existence. Then, in one smooth motion, he drank it all. The poison burned as it went down, a fire that should have melted his insides instantly, and yet he did not collapse. He did not scream. He simply lowered the goblet, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at the Xelvari Chancellor with the faintest hint of a smirk. "Not bad," he said casually, his voice carrying through the deathly silent arena. A bit bitter, though. The silence that followed was absolute. The Xelvari scientists, once relaxed and confident, suddenly scrambled in panic. They scanned their instruments, whispering frantically among themselves. Their poison had never failed before. It was impossible. The High Chancellor's smug expression twisted into something unreadable shock. Anger, maybe even fear. Elias stood there, his heart beating steadily, his body completely unaffected. The poison had done nothing to him. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, turning into a wave of murmurs. The other alien species, those who had lived under the shadow of the Xelvari's rule, began to realize what this meant. The poison was their greatest weapon. If humans were immune to it, then what else had the Xelvari been lying about? The thought spread like wildfire, rippling through the gathered audience. The Xelvari Chancellor slammed his fist against the armrest of his throne. "This is a trick," he spat, his yellow eyes burning with fury. "No being can withstand the black venom. No one." His words were filled with desperation, but the damage had already been done. The Xelvari's greatest weapon had been rendered useless before the entire galaxy, and no amount of denial could undo what had just happened. Elias could feel the shift in the air, the way the tension had turned against the Xelvari. He met the Chancellor's furious gaze, his own eyes steady and unshaken. "Looks like we can," he said simply. Across the galaxy, the event was broadcasted to countless worlds. Entire civilizations who had lived in fear of the Xelvari now saw something they had never imagined a weakness. The Xelvari were not untouchable, not invincible. The impossible had happened. A human had drunk their deadliest poison, and he had survived. The balance of power had shifted, and the first cracks had formed in the foundation of the Dominion's rule. The Xelvari had built their empire on fear, but fear only worked if people believed in it. And now, For the first time in history, the Xelvari had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated humanity. The vast galactic arena was packed with thousands of spectators, their alien eyes fixed on the single human standing on the platform. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The Xelvari, the most feared species in the galaxy, had issued a challenge that no one had ever survived. At the heart of the arena, placed on a pedestal of dark metal, was a goblet filled with black venom, the deadliest poison known to exist. The Xelvari Dominion had used this toxin for centuries, eliminating entire species, crushing rebellions, and proving their absolute superiority. No being had ever withstood its effects. It was a weapon that ensured submission, a silent promise of agony and death. Now, they had invited humanity to prove their worth, but it was nothing more than a cruel game, a display of power to remind the galaxy who truly ruled. If the human died, Earth would fall under Xelvari control. If he refused, it would be seen as cowardice, and war would be inevitable. Either way, the Dominion expected to win. Captain Elias Carter stood motionless, his sharp eyes studying the goblet. He could feel the weight of 1 billion unseen eyes watching him through broadcast screens across the galaxy. The Xelvari High Chancellor, a towering figure with glistening green scales, sat upon his ornate throne at the far end of the arena. His golden eyes gleamed with amusement, confident that the human would either collapse in agony or beg for mercy. Leaning forward, his voice slithered through the air. "You may still walk away, human. No one will think less of you after all. Only a fool would accept such a challenge." Laughter rippled through the Xelvari audience, their voices hissing in mockery. The aliens of the Galactic Council, seated on raised platforms above, remained silent. They had seen this before. Many had lost leaders, warriors, and champions to this very challenge. None had survived. The outcome was already decided, or so they believed. Elias slowly reached for the goblet, his fingers curling around the cool metal. He could see the thick black liquid inside, swirling unnaturally, almost alive. The poison had a reputation beyond death. It was said to dissolve bones, ignite the blood, and cause agony so intense that victims often tore their own flesh apart before the poison finally claimed them. Every fiber of common sense screamed at him to stop, to drop the goblet, to refuse this madness. But common sense had never won wars. Fear had never changed history. He lifted the goblet to eye level, staring into the darkness within. Then, without hesitation, he drank. A collective gasp filled the arena. Every pair of eyes locked onto him, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The poison was supposed to act instantly. His throat should have burned as if swallowed by fire. His stomach should have twisted into unbearable pain. His blood should have boiled. But nothing happened. Elias lowered the goblet, wiped his mouth, and looked directly at the High Chancellor. For a long moment, there was silence. Then he spoke. "Not bad," he said casually, his voice steady. "A bit bitter, though." The arena erupted into chaos. The Xelvari spectators rose from their seats, hissing in disbelief. The scientists who had spent centuries perfecting the black venom scrambled for their instruments, scanning their data in frantic confusion. The Galactic Council, who had seen countless warriors fall before this poison, exchanged stunned glances. This had never happened before. No one could withstand the poison. It was impossible. And yet, the humans stood there unshaken, unharmed. The High Chancellor's amusement vanished in an instant. His golden eyes darkened with something far more dangerous than anger uncertainty. He turned sharply to his advisors, his voice dropping into a sharp whisper. "He should be dead." "Why isn't he dead?" But no one had an answer. The poison had never failed before. The very foundation of their rule had been built on the fear of it. Now, in front of the entire galaxy, that fear was crumbling. Elias took a step forward, his expression calm but his mind racing. He had gambled everything on this moment. It wasn't blind luck that had saved him. Humanity had suspected something like this would happen. Over the years, Earth scientists had studied alien biology, analyzing toxins, adapting to new environments, pushing the limits of human resilience. The truth was simple. Humans were different. Their immune systems were unlike any other species in the galaxy. What was lethal to others might not work the same way on them. The black venom, so effective on thousands of alien species, had failed against humanity. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. The idea spread like wildfire through the arena. If the poison couldn't kill a human, then what else had the Xelvari lied about? What else were they hiding? Across the galaxy, rebels who had once feared the Xelvari watched in stunned silence, their hope reigniting. The Xelvari's power was built on intimidation, but fear only worked if people believed in it. And now, for the first time, that belief was shattered. The High Chancellor rose from his throne, his scaled fists clenched. "This is a trick," he snarled, his voice shaking with fury. "Humans cannot resist the black venom. You have tampered with the poison." But the data told a different story. The readings were clear. The poison was real. The human should have died. But he hadn't. The tension in the air turned dangerous. The Chancellor could see the doubt forming in the eyes of the Galactic Council, the uncertainty spreading among his own people. If this information spread, if more species realized the Xelvari were not as all-powerful as they claimed, then rebellions would rise, and the Dominion's rule would be threatened. He had to act fast. Elias saw the fear in the Chancellor's eyes. Not anger, fear. The Xelvari had made a mistake, and they knew it. They had revealed their strongest weapon to the entire galaxy, only for it to fail in the most humiliating way possible. The human placed the empty goblet back on the pedestal, his movements slow, deliberate. He turned his back to the Xelvari, facing the Galactic Council, and let his words echo through the arena. The Xelvari rule through fear, but fear only works when you believe in it. Today, the galaxy has seen the truth. And the truth is, they are not invincible. The Chancellor's furious roar filled the chamber, but it was already too late. The galaxy had seen what they were never meant to see. The poison had failed. The Xelvari's greatest weapon was useless against humanity. And in that moment, the first cracks in their empire had begun to form. The news spread like wildfire. The moment had been broadcasted across the galaxy, reaching every world, every empire, every species that had lived under the shadow of the Xelvari Dominion. A human, an insignificant being from an unremarkable world, had drunk the black venom, the deadliest poison known to exist and survive. The impossible had happened, and with it, the very foundation of the Dominion's power had begun to crack. The Xelvari had ruled through fear, their dominance built on the certainty that no one could defy them and live. But now, the galaxy had seen the truth. They had seen the poison fail. They had seen the shock in the High Chancellor's golden eyes, the frantic movements of the Xelvari scientists as they desperately searched for an explanation. And most of all, they had seen the humans stand tall, unharmed, fearless. The illusion of Xelvari supremacy had been shattered. Across distant worlds, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into movements. On planets where Xelvari rule had been absolute, species that had once accepted their fate now began to question everything. If the poison was not absolute, then what else had the Xelvari lied about? Could they be resisted? Could they be defeated? For centuries, rebellion had been nothing more than a foolish dream, a futile effort crushed before it even began. But now, that dream was alive once more. Underground resistance groups that had been silent for decades emerged from the shadows, emboldened by the humans' defiance. Secret transmissions spread across space, carrying the message, the Xelvari are not invincible. Humanity has shown the way. The Dominion spies reported increased unrest, quiet discussions in the streets turning into open defiance. The carefully maintained order of the Xelvari Empire was beginning to collapse, not through war, not through invasion, but through the simple act of one man standing unbroken. On the throne world of the Xelvari Dominion, the High Chancellor stood in the heart of the Great War Chamber, surrounded by his advisors. The tension in the air was suffocating. The once loyal officials, who had always agreed with him without hesitation, now spoke in hushed tones, their voices laced with doubt. The data was undeniable. The human should have died. The poison had worked on thousands of species before. Its failure had been impossible, and yet it happened in front of the entire galaxy. The Chancellor's golden eyes burned with fury as he slammed a clawed fist onto the stone table. "We must act swiftly," he hissed, "before the cracks in our empire become too deep to repair." But his advisors remained silent, their expressions grim. They all knew the truth. The cracks had already formed. Meanwhile, on Earth, humanity was watching the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. The Xelvari had ruled unchecked for centuries, their power unchallenged. But now, the tables had turned. Elias Carter, the man who had drunk the black venom and lived, had become a symbol. His image was displayed across human colonies, his name spoken in admiration. He had not only survived the challenge, he had done something greater. He had proven that the Xelvari could be defied. Yet, he knew this was only the beginning. The Dominion would not remain silent. The High Chancellor would not allow his empire to crumble without a fight. Humanity had won the first battle, but war was coming. The Xelvari would strike back, harder than ever before. In the depths of space, the Dominion's fleets were already mobilizing. The Chancellor's orders were clear: crush the resistance before it spreads. Any world that dared to question Xelvari rule would be burned. Any species that dared to speak of the humans' defiance would be silenced. The Xelvari ships moved swiftly, their presence a dark omen of the storm that was about to be unleashed. But something had changed. Fear no longer controlled the galaxy as it once did. Some planets, instead of cowering, prepared to fight. Some fleets, instead of obeying orders, hesitated. The unity of the Dominion was fracturing. The Chancellor had ruled through fear, but fear only worked when it was absolute. And after what had happened in the arena, that absolute fear was gone. Elias stood in the command center of Earth's military headquarters, watching the stars beyond the reinforced glass. He knew the Xelvari would come. He knew they would try to erase what had happened, to bury the truth beneath the ashes of war. But he also knew one thing that the Chancellor did not: humanity was ready. They had prepared for this moment, for the day when they would no longer be ignored. The Xelvari believed they were striking at an enemy that was still weak, still divided. But they had underestimated the one thing that had always made humans different. Humanity did not break. Humanity fought back. The galaxy was no longer the same. The moment the black venom failed against the human, the foundation of Xelvari rule had begun to crumble. What had once been an unshakable empire, built on fear and absolute control, now faced something far more dangerous than open rebellion and doubt. The Xelvari had always ruled with terror, crushing those who defied them with swift, brutal efficiency. But now, their greatest weapon, the fear they had instilled in every species, was breaking apart like glass. Across the stars, whispers turned into shouts, and those who had once cowered in silence now spoke with defiance. The Dominion had tried to dismiss the incident, calling it a trick, a deception, but the truth had already spread too far. No matter how much they denied it, every sentient being knew the reality. The black venom had failed, and a human had survived. The symbol of Xelvari dominance had been shattered, and with it, the illusion of their invincibility. On countless worlds, the consequences of that single moment rippled outward. Resistance movements, long buried under years of oppression, suddenly found new strength. Small uprisings turned into full-scale revolts. Armies that had once fought for the Dominion hesitated, questioning their loyalty to rulers who no longer seemed untouchable. The Xelvari had always believed their grip on the galaxy was eternal, but now their own people were beginning to doubt. Soldiers whispered in hushed voices about the human who had defied death. Officers hesitated before carrying out brutal orders, uncertain if they were still serving the strongest force in the universe or an empire teetering on the edge of collapse. And in the shadows of the Dominion, powerful factions that had once feared retribution began making plans, sensing that the time to strike had finally come. The High Chancellor of the Xelvari Dominion sat in his grand war chamber, his golden eyes narrowed in fury. His advisors stood in tense silence, awaiting his command, but they already knew the truth: the Dominion was unraveling. Never before had so many worlds shown open defiance. Never before had their military suffered such widespread disobedience. And never before had their rule been questioned so openly. "We must remind them," the Chancellor growled, his voice a low hiss of controlled rage. "Remind them why they feared us in the first place." His claws dug into the stone table before him. "If fear is breaking, then we must make them fear again." The order was given. The Xelvari fleets, vast and merciless, launched from their homeworlds, descending upon rebellious planets with fire and destruction. Entire cities were burned, their people slaughtered as a warning. The Dominion believed that with enough force, they could restore the terror that had kept them in power. But they had underestimated one simple truth: fear could only work if people believed in it. And now, after seeing a human defy the impossible, many no longer did. As the Xelvari unleashed destruction upon rebellious worlds, they expected surrender. They expected begging, panic, and hopelessness. Instead, they found resistance. Armies that should have fled instead stood their ground. Fighters who should have surrendered instead launched counterattacks. For the first time in centuries, species that had always submitted now dared to challenge their masters. The poison's failure had not just broken fear, it had awakened something far more dangerous: hope. And nowhere was that hope stronger than on Earth. Humanity, the species that had unknowingly become the symbol of defiance, had been preparing. The moment Elias Carter had stood unbroken in the galactic arena, Earth's leaders knew what would come next. The Xelvari would not tolerate their existence. They would strike with everything they had. But humans were no strangers to war. They did not wait for the enemy to come to them. They had already begun building alliances. When the Xelvari fleets arrived in human-controlled space, they expected an easy conquest. They expected to crush humanity before the flames of rebellion could spread further. Instead, they were met with a coalition. Ships from species that had once been enslaved now fought alongside human warships. Generals who had once bowed to the Xelvari now stood with Earth's leaders. Humanity had not only defied the poison, they had united the oppressed. The first major battle was unlike anything the Dominion had faced before. Their fleet, once the undisputed masters of space warfare, found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outmatched. Human technology, though young compared to the ancient war machines of the Dominion, had one advantage: adaptation. The Xelvari had ruled for so long that they had stopped evolving, stopped innovating. They had relied on the certainty that no one could challenge them. But humans were different. They learned. They changed. They fought without fear. The battle was brutal, and for the first time in recorded history, the Xelvari lost. A Dominion fleet, once considered unstoppable, was forced into retreat. The news spread faster than light. The mighty Xelvari, who had crushed civilizations for centuries, had been defeated. The galaxy trembled not from fear, but from hope. In the aftermath of the battle, the High Chancellor stood in the ruins of his war chamber, staring at the reports flashing across his screens. Every calculation, every strategy he had relied upon had collapsed. His fleet commanders, once proud and arrogant, now stood before him in disgrace. His empire, once unquestioned, now faced its greatest threat: not an enemy with superior weapons, but an enemy that had broken the very foundation of his rule. The fear that had kept his empire intact was gone, and in its place, rebellion burned. The Xelvari Dominion was no longer the unchallenged power of the galaxy. The age of fear was over. The age of resistance had begun. The galaxy was on fire. What had once been a vast and unchallenged empire, spanning thousands of worlds and ruled with an iron grip, was now crumbling under its own weight. The Xelvari Dominion, the supreme power that had enslaved entire civilizations and crushed rebellions before they could even begin, was now facing its worst nightmare: a war they could not win. Fear had been their greatest weapon, but fear had died the moment a human drank the black venom and survived. That single event had broken the illusion of Xelvari invincibility, and once that illusion shattered, their enemies multiplied. Across the stars, species that had once cowered in submission now rose with fury. Rebellions that had once been scattered and weak now moved with coordination and purpose. And at the heart of it all, standing at the front lines of the resistance, was humanity. The war had begun with scattered uprisings, but it did not stay that way for long. The Xelvari, desperate to reclaim control, launched a brutal campaign to silence the rebels. Entire cities were burned, entire planets left in ruin, all in an attempt to force the galaxy back into submission. But this time, the fear did not return. The resistance did not break. Instead, they fought harder. They did not surrender. They did not kneel. And when humanity unleashed its war fleets alongside the rebel forces, the Xelvari finally realized the truth: they had lost control. Their once mighty empire, built on the obedience of billions, now faced a coalition of species who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. For the first time in their history, the Xelvari were outnumbered. The battles that followed were unlike anything the Dominion had ever experienced. Their fleets, once feared across the stars, now struggled against an enemy that refused to fight the way they expected. Humans and their allies did not wage war with rigid formations or predictable strategies. They adapted, they improvised, and they struck where the Xelvari were weakest. Planets that had once been strongholds of the Dominion now fell one by one, their garrisons overwhelmed, their fleets shattered. The High Chancellor, once the unchallenged ruler of the galaxy, now watched in horror as reports flooded and entire sectors lost, entire legions wiped out, entire fleets refusing to obey orders. The loyalty that had once held the Dominion together was dissolving. Even within the Xelvari themselves, the cracks had spread too deep to repair. Their leaders, once united in their rule, now turned on each other in desperation. Some called for a retreat, others for a final stand, and others still whispered of surrender. The High Chancellor, blinded by arrogance, refused to accept the truth. "We are the rulers of this galaxy," he snarled to his remaining generals. "We have ruled for centuries. We will not fall to vermin." But even as he spoke, the war was already lost. On the battlefield, humanity proved why they had become the heart of the rebellion. Unlike the Xelvari, who had spent centuries ruling through fear, humans had spent their existence fighting against impossible odds. They did not know how to kneel. They only knew how to fight. The Dominion's forces had expected humans to break, to retreat, to fear the power of the Xelvari. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that fought without hesitation, without fear of death, without mercy. And when the Xelvari finally realized this, it was too late. The final battle took place above Xelvaris Prime, the capital of the Dominion. The High Chancellor had gathered the last of his fleet, determined to make a final stand. The mightiest warships of the Dominion, each one powerful enough to destroy a planet, formed an impenetrable defensive line. They believed that if they could hold the capital, they could still rebuild. They were wrong. The combined forces of the rebellion, led by humanity, descended upon the Xelvari homeworld like an unstoppable storm. The battle raged for hours, then days. The Xelvari fought with the desperation of a dying empire, throwing everything they had at the invaders. But it was not enough. The rebels did not stop. Humanity did not stop. One by one, the Xelvari warships fell. Their great defenses crumbled under relentless assault. Their fleets, once symbols of terror, were reduced to burning wreckage. And in the final moments of the battle, as the High Chancellor watched his empire collapse around him, he finally understood what had happened. Fear had failed. Power built on fear could not last forever. When the final Xelvari defenses fell, the rebellion did not hesitate. They stormed the capital, not as conquerors, but as liberators. The people of Xelvaris Prime, who had lived under the rule of their own ruthless leaders, did not resist. They did not fight for their dying empire. They welcomed its destruction. And as the High Chancellor was dragged from his throne, as the banners of the Dominion were torn down, the galaxy witnessed something it had never seen before: the fall of the Xelvari Dominion. The war was over. The empire that had ruled for centuries had been erased from history. And in its place, a new future had begun. One where fear no longer ruled. one where the galaxy was no longer shackled under the tyranny of the Xelvari. The species that had once been slaves, once been outcasts, once been hunted, now stood together as equals. And at the center of it all, standing in the ruins of the fallen empire, was humanity. They had not just survived. They had changed the course of galactic history. The Xelvari Dominion was no more. And in its place, something new had risen. Something better.